Part 4. Genesis of a Communist. 1. Childhood. On the 5 or 6 sets of questions I had submitted on different matters, Mao had talked for a dozen nights, hardly ever referring to himself or his own role in some of the events described. I was beginning to think it was hopeless to expect him to give me such details. He obviously considered the individual of very little importance. Like other Reds I met, he tended to talk only about committees, organizations, armies, revolutions, battles, tactics, measures, and so on, and seldom of personal experience. For a while I thought this reluctance to expand on subjective matters, or even the exploits of their comrades as individuals, might derive from modesty, or a fear or suspicion of me, or a consciousness of the price so many of these men had on their heads. Later on I discovered that was not so much the case as it was that most of them actually did not remember personal details. As I began collecting biographies, I found repeatedly that the communist would be able to tell everything that had happened in his early youth, but once he had become identified with the Red Army, he lost himself somewhere, and without repeated questioning, one could hear nothing about him, but only stories of the army, or the Soviets, or the party, capitalized. These men could talk indefinitely about dates and circumstances of battles and movements to and from 1,000 unheard-of places, but those events seemed to have had significance for them only collectively, not because they as individuals had made history there, but because the Red Army had been there, and behind it a whole organic force of an ideology for which they were fighting. It was an interesting discovery, but it made difficult reporting. One night, when all other questions had been satisfied, Mao turned to the list that I had headed Personal History. He smiled at a question. "How many times have you been married?" And the rumor later spread that I had asked Mao how many wives he had. He was skeptical anyway about the necessity for supplying an autobiography, but I argued that in a way that was more important than information on other matters. People want to know what sort of man you are, I said, when they read what you say. Then you ought to also correct some of the false rumors circulating. I reminded him of various reports of his death, how some people believed he spoke fluent French, while others said he was an ignorant peasant, how one report described him as a half-dead tubercular, while others maintained that he was a mad fanatic. He seemed mildly surprised that people should spend their time speculating about him. He agreed that such reports ought to be corrected. Then he looked over the items again as I had written them down. "Suppose," he said at last, "that I just disregard your questions and instead give you a general sketch of my life. I think it will be more understandable, and in the end all of your questions will be answered just the same." During the nightly interviews that followed, we were like conspirators indeed, huddled in that cave over the red-covered table, with sputtering candles between us. I wrote up until I was ready to fall asleep. Wu Liangbing sat next to me and interpreted Mao's soft southern dialect, in which a chicken, instead of being a good substantial northern ji, became a romantic yi, and Hunan became Funan, and a bowl of cha turned into ca, and many other such stranger variations occurred. Mao related everything from memory, and I put it down as he talked. It was, as I have said, retranslated and corrected, and this is the result, with no attempt to give it literary excellence beyond some necessary corrections in the syntax of the patient Mr. Wu. I was born in the village of Shaoshan in Xiangdan Xian, Hunan province, in 1893. My father's name was Mao Jianshang, and my mother's maiden name was Wen Jimei. My father was a poor peasant, and while still young was obligated to join the army because of heavy debts. He was a soldier for many years. Later on he returned to the village where I was born, and by saving carefully and gathering together a little money through small trading and other enterprise, he managed to buy back his land. As middle peasants then, my family owned 15 mo of land. On this they could raise 60 tan of rice a year. The 5 members of the family consumed a total of 35 tan, that is, about 7 each, which left an annual surplus of 25 tan. Using this surplus, my father accumulated a little capital, and in time purchased 7 more mo, which gave the family the status of rich peasants. We could then raise 84 tan of rice a year. When I was 10 years of age and the family owned only 15 mo of land, the 5 members of the family consisted of my father, mother, grandfather, younger brother, and myself. After we had acquired the additional 7 mo, my grandfather died, but there came another younger brother. However, we had a surplus of 49 tan of rice each year, and on this my father steadily prospered. At the time my father was a middle peasant, he began to deal in grain transport and selling, by which he made a little money. After he became a rich peasant, he devoted most of his time to that business. He hired a full-time farm labourer and put his children to work on the farm, as well as his wife. I began to work at farming tasks when I was 6 years old. My father had no shop for his business. He simply purchased grain from the poor farmers and then transported it to the city merchants, where he got a higher price. In the winter, when the rice was being ground, he hired an extra labourer to work on the farm, so that at the time there were 7 mouths to feed. My family ate frugally, but had enough always. I began studying in a local primary school when I was 8, and remained there until I was 13 years old. In the early morning and at night I worked on the farm. During the day I read the Confucian Analects and the 4 classics. My Chinese teacher belonged to the stern treatment school. He was harsh and severe, frequently beating his students. Because of that I ran away from the school when I was 10. I was afraid to return home for fear of receiving a beating there, and set out in the general direction of the city, which I believed to be in a valley somewhere. I wandered for 3 days before I was finally found by my family. Then I learned that I had circled round and round in my travels, and in all my walking had only got about 8 li from my home. After my return to the family, however, to my surprise, conditions somewhat improved. My father was slightly more considerate, and the teacher was more inclined to moderation. The result of my act of protest impressed me very much. It was a successful strike. My father wanted me to begin keeping the family books as soon as I had learned a few characters. He wanted me to learn to use the abacus. As my father insisted upon this, I began to work at those accounts at night. He was a very severe taskmaster. He hated to see me idle, and if there were no books to be kept, he put me to work at farm tasks. He was a hot-tempered man, and frequently beat both me and my brothers. He gave us no money whatsoever, and the most meagre food. On the 15th day of every month he made a concession to his labourers and gave them eggs with their rice, but never meat. To me he gave neither eggs nor meat. My mother was a kind woman, generous and sympathetic, and ever ready to share what she had. She pitied the poor, and often gave them rice when they came to ask for it during famines. But she could not do so when my father was present. He disapproved of charity. We had many quarrels in my home over this question. There were 2 parties in the family. One was my father, the ruling power, the opposition of which was made up of myself, my mother, my brother, and sometimes even the labourer. In the united front of the opposition, however, there was a difference of opinion. My mother advocated a policy of indirect attack. She criticised any overt display of emotion and attempts at open rebellion against the ruling power. She said it was not the Chinese way. But when I was 13, I discovered a powerful argument of my own for debating with my father on his own ground, by quoting the classics. My father's favourite accusations against me were of unfilial conduct and laziness. I quoted in exchange passages from the classics saying that the elder must be kind and affectionate. Against his charge that I was lazy, I used the rebuttal that older people should do more work than younger, that my father was over 3 times as old as myself and therefore should do more work, and I declared that when I was his age I would be much more energetic. The old man continued to amass wealth, or what was considered to be a great fortune in that little village. He did not buy more land himself, but he bought many mortgages on other people's land. His capital grew to 2,000 or 3,000 Chinese dollars. My dissatisfaction increased. The dialectical struggle in our family was constantly developing. One incident I especially remember when I was about 13. My father invited many guests to his home, and while they were present a dispute arose between the 2 of us. My father denounced me before the whole group, calling me lazy and useless. This infuriated me. I cursed him and left the house. My mother ran after me and tried to persuade me to return. My father also pursued me, cursing at the same time that he commanded me to come back. I reached the edge of a pond and threatened to jump in if he came any nearer. In this situation, demands and counter-demands were presented for cessation of the civil war. My father insisted that I apologize and kowtow as a sign of submission. I agreed to give a 1-knee kowtow if he would promise not to beat me. Thus the war ended, and from it I learned that when I defended my rights by open rebellion, my father relented, but when I remained meek and submissive, he only cursed and beat me the more. Reflecting on this, I think that in the end the strictness of my father defeated him. I learned to hate him, and we created a real united front against him. At the same time, it probably benefited me. It made me most diligent in my work. It made me keep my books carefully so that he should have no basis for criticizing me. My father had 2 years of schooling, and he could read enough to keep books. My mother was wholly illiterate. Both were from peasant families. I was the family scholar. I knew the classics, but disliked them. What I enjoyed were the romances of old China, and especially stories of rebellions. I read the Yue Fei Zhuan, the You Fei Chronicles, She Hu Zhuan, the Water Margin, Fan Tang, Revolt against the Tang, Sangguo, the Three Kingdoms, and Xi Yu Ji, Travels to the West, the story of Xuanzang's 7th century semi-legendary pilgrimage to India, while still very young. And despite the vigilance of my old teacher, who hated these outlawed books and called them wicked, I used to read them in school, covering them up with a classic when a teacher walked past. So also did most of my schoolmates. We learned many of the stories almost by heart and discussed and rediscussed them many times. We knew more of them than the old men of the village, who also loved them and used to exchange stories with us. I believe that perhaps I was much influenced by such books, read at an impressionable age. I finally left the primary school when I was 13 and began to work long hours on the farm, helping the hired labourer, doing the full labour of a man during the day and at night keeping books for my father. Nevertheless, I succeeded in continuing my reading, devouring everything I could find except the classics. This annoyed my father, who wanted me to master the classics, especially after he was defeated in a lawsuit because of an apt classical quotation used by his adversary in the Chinese court. I used to cover up the window of my room late at night so that my father would not see the light. In this way, I read a book called Shangshi Wei Yan, Words of Warning, which I liked very much. The author, one of a number of old reformist scholars, thought that the weakness of China lay in her lack of Western appliances, railways, telephones, telegraphs, and steamships, and wanted to have them introduced to the country. My father considered such books a waste of time. He wanted me to read something practical like the classics, which could help him in winning lawsuits. I continued to read the old romances and tales of Chinese literature. It occurred to me one day that there was one thing particular about such stories, and that was the absence of peasants who tilled the land. All the characters were warriors, officials, or scholars. There was never a peasant hero. I wondered about this for 2 years, and then I analysed the content of the stories. I found that they all glorified men of arms, rulers of the people, who did not have to work the land, because they owned and controlled it and evidently made the peasants work it for them. My father was in his early days, and in middle age, a skeptic, but my mother devoutly worshipped Buddha. She gave her children religious instruction, and we were all saddened that our father was an unbeliever. When I was 9 years old, I seriously discussed the problem of my father's lack of piety with my mother. We made many attempts then and later to convert him, but without success. He only cursed us, and overwhelmed by his attacks, we withdrew to devise new plans. But he would have nothing to do with the gods. My reading gradually began to influence me, however. I myself became more and more skeptical. My mother became concerned about me and scolded me for my indifference to the requirements of the faith, but my father made no comment. Then one day he went out on the road to collect some money, and on his way he met a tiger. The tiger was surprised at the encounter and fled at once, but my father was even more astonished, and afterwards reflected a good deal on his miraculous escape. He began to wonder if he had not offended the gods. From then on he showed more respect to Buddhism and burned incense now and then. Yet when my own backsliding grew worse, the old man did not interfere. He prayed to the gods only when he was in difficulties. Shangshi Wei Yan, Words of Warning, stimulated in me a desire to resume my studies. I had also become disgusted with my labour on the farm. My father naturally opposed me. We quarrelled about it, and finally I ran away from home. I went to the home of an unemployed law student, and there I studied for half a year. After that I studied more of the classics under an old Chinese scholar, and also read many contemporary articles and a few books. At this time, an incident occurred in Hunan which influenced my whole life. Outside the little Chinese school where I was studying, we students noticed many bean merchants coming back from Changsha. We asked them why they were all leaving. They told us about a big uprising in the city. There had been a severe famine that year, and in Changsha, thousands were without food. The starving sent a delegation to the civil governor to beg for relief, but he replied to them haughtily, "Why haven't you food? There is plenty in the city. I always have enough." When the people were told the governor's reply, they became very angry. They held mass meetings and organized a demonstration. They attacked the Manchu yamen, cut down the flagpole, the symbol of office, and drove out the governor. Following this, the Commissioner of Internal Affairs, a man named Chang, came out on his horse and told the people that the government would take measures to help them. Chang was evidently sincere in his promise, but the emperor disliked him and accused him of having intimate connections with the mob. He was removed. A new governor arrived and at once ordered the arrest of the leaders of the uprising. Many of them were beheaded and their heads displayed on poles as a warning to future rebels. This incident was discussed in my school for many days. It made a deep impression on me. Most of the other students sympathized with the insurrectionists, but only from an observer's point of view. They did not understand that it had any relation to their own lives. They were merely interested in it as an exciting incident. I never forgot it. I felt that there, with the rebels, were ordinary people like my own family, and I deeply resented the injustice of the treatment given to them. Not long afterward, in Shaoshan, there was a conflict between members of the Gelao Hui, a secret society, and a local landlord. He sued them in court, and as he was a powerful landlord, he easily brought a decision favorable to himself. The Gelao Hui members were defeated, but instead of submitting, they rebelled against the landlord and the government and withdrew to a local mountain called Liushan, where they built a stronghold. Troops were sent against them, and the landlord spread a story that they had sacrificed a child when they raised the banner of revolt. The leader of the rebels was called Bang, the millstone maker. They were finally suppressed, and Bang was forced to flee. He was eventually captured and beheaded. In the eyes of the students, however, he was a hero, for all sympathized with the revolt. Next year, when the new rice was not yet harvested and the winter rice was exhausted, there was a food shortage in our district. The poor demanded help from the rich farmers, and they began a movement called Eat Rice Without Charge. My father was a rice merchant and was exporting much grain to the city from our district, despite the shortage. One of his consignments was seized by the poor villagers, and his wrath was boundless. I did not sympathize with him. At the same time, I thought the villagers' method was wrong also. Another influence on me at this time was the presence in a local primary school of a radical teacher. He was radical because he was opposed to Buddhism and wanted to get rid of the gods. He urged people to convert their temples into schools. He was a widely discussed personality. I admired him and agreed with his views. These incidents occurring closer together made lasting impressions on my young mind, already rebellious. In this period also, I began to have a certain amount of political consciousness, especially after I read a pamphlet telling of the dismemberment of China. I remember even now that this pamphlet opened with the sentence, "Alas, China will be subjugated." It told of Japan's occupation of Korea and Taiwan, of the loss of suzerainty in Indochina, Burma, and elsewhere. After I read this, I felt depressed about the future of my country and began to realize that it was the duty of all the people to help save it. My father had decided to apprentice me to a rice shop in Xiangdan, with which he had connections. I was not opposed to it at first, thinking it might be interesting, but about this time I heard of an unusual new school and made up my mind to go there, despite my father's opposition. This school was in Xiangxiang, where my mother's family lived. A cousin of mine was a student there, and he told me of the new school and of the changing conditions in modern education. There was less emphasis on the classics, and more was taught of the new knowledge of the West. The educational methods also were quite radical. I went to the school with my cousin and registered. I claimed to be a Xiangxiang man because I understood that the school was only open to natives of Xiangxiang. Later on, I took my true status as a Xiangdan native when I discovered that the place was open to all. I paid 1,400 coppers here for 5 months' board, lodging, and all materials necessary for my study. My father finally agreed to let me enter after friends had argued to him that this advanced education would increase my earning powers. This was the first time I had been as far away from home as 50 li. I was 16 years old. In the new school I could study natural science and new subjects of Western learning. Another notable thing was that one of the teachers was a returned student from Japan, and he wore a false queue, which is a kind of hairstyle that was enforced at the time by the Manchus. It was quite easy to tell that his queue was false. Everyone laughed at him and called him the false foreign devil. I had never before seen so many children together. Most of them were sons of landlords wearing expensive clothes. Very few peasants could afford to send their children to such a school. I was more poorly dressed than the others. I owned only one decent coat and trousers suit. Gowns were not worn by students, but only by the teachers, and none but foreign devils wore foreign clothes. Many of the richer students despised me, because usually I was wearing my ragged coat and trousers. However, among them I had friends, and 2 especially were my good comrades. One of those is now a writer living in Soviet Russia. I was also disliked because I was not a native of Xiangxiang. It was very important to be a native of Xiangxiang, and also important to be from a certain district of Xiangxiang. There was an upper, lower, and middle district, and lower and upper were continually fighting, purely on a regional basis. Neither could become reconciled to the existence of the other. I took a neutral position in this war because I was not a native at all. Consequently, all 3 factions despised me. I felt spiritually very depressed. I made good progress at this school. The teachers liked me, especially those who taught the classics, because I wrote good essays in the classical manner. But my mind was not on the classics. I was reading 2 books sent to me by my cousin telling me of the reform movement of Kang Yuwei. One was by Liang Qichao, editor of the Xinmin Zongbao, New People's Miscellany. I read and reread these books until I knew them by heart. I worshipped Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao, and was very grateful to my cousin, whom I then thought very progressive, but who later became a counter-revolutionary, a member of the gentry, and joined the reactionaries of the period of the Great Revolution of 1925 to 1927. Many of the students disliked the false foreign devil because of his inhuman cue, but I liked hearing him talk about Japan. He taught music and English. One of his songs was Japanese and was called The Battle on the Yellow Sea. I still remember some charming words from it. The sparrow sings, the nightingale dances, and the green fields are lovely in the spring. The pomegranate flowers crimson, the willows are green-leaved, and there is a new picture. At that time I knew and felt the beauty of Japan, and felt something of her pride and might. In this song of her victory over Russia, I did not think there was also a barbarous Japan, the Japan we know today. This is all I learned from the false foreign devil. I recall also that at about this time I first heard that the Emperor and Cixi, the Empress Dowager, were both dead. Although the new Emperor, Puyi, had already been ruling for 2 years, I was not yet an anti-monarchist. Indeed, I considered the Emperor, as well as most officials, to be honest, good, and clever men. They only needed the help of Kang Yuwei's reforms. I was fascinated by accounts of the rulers of ancient China, Yao, Shun, Qinshi Huangdi, and Han Wudi, and read many books about them. I also learned something of foreign history at this time, and of geography. I had first heard of America in an article which told of the American Revolution and contained a sentence like this: "After 8 years of difficult war, Washington won victory and built up his nation." In a book called Great Heroes of the World, I read also of Napoleon, Catherine of Russia, Peter the Great, Wellington, Gladstone, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Lincoln. 2. Days in Changsha. Mao Zedong continued. I began to long to go to Changsha, the great city, the capital of the province, which was 120 li from my home. It was said that this city was very big, contained many people, numerous schools, and the yamen of the governor. It was a magnificent place altogether. I wanted very much to go there at this time, and to enter middle school for Xiangxiang people. That winter I asked one of my teachers in the higher primary school to introduce me there. The teacher agreed, and I walked to Changsha, exceedingly excited, half fearing that I would be refused entrance, hardly daring to hope that I could actually become a student in this great school. To my astonishment, I was admitted without difficulty, but political events were moving rapidly, and I was to remain there only half a year. In Changsha I read my first newspaper, Minli Bao, People's Strength, a nationalist revolutionary journal which told of the Canton uprising against the Manchu dynasty, and the death of the 72 heroes under the leadership of a Hunanese man named Huang Xing. I was most impressed with this story and found the Minli Bao full of stimulating material. It was edited by Yu Yujian, who later became a famous leader of the Kuomintang. I learned also of Sun Yat-sen at this time, and of the program of the Dongmenhui. The country was on the eve of the First Revolution. I was so agitated that I wrote an article which I posted on the school wall. It was my first expression of a political opinion, and it was somewhat muddled. I had not yet given up my admiration of Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao. I did not clearly understand the differences between them. Therefore, in my article, I advocated that Sun Yat-sen must be called back from Japan to become president of the new government, that Kang Yuwei be made premier, and Liang Qichao Minister of Foreign Affairs. The anti-foreign capital movement began in connection with the building of the Sichuan-Hankou Railway, and a popular demand for a parliament became widespread. In reply to it, the emperor decreed merely that an advisory council be created. The students in my school became more and more agitated. They demonstrated their anti-Manchu sentiments by a rebellion against the pigtail. One friend and I clipped off our pigtails, but others who had promised to do so afterward failed to keep their word. My friend and I therefore assaulted them in secret and forcibly removed their queues, a total of more than 10 falling victim to our shears. Thus, in a short space of time, I progressed from ridiculing the false foreign devil's imitation queue to demanding the general abolition of queues. How a political idea can change a point of view. I got into a dispute with a friend in a law school over the pigtail episode, and we each advanced opposing theories on the subject. The law student held that the body, skin, hair, and nails are heritages from one's parents and must not be destroyed, quoting the classics to clinch his argument. But I myself and the anti-pigtailers developed a counter-theory on an anti-Manchu political basis, and thoroughly silenced him. After the Wuhan uprising occurred, led by Li Yuanhong, martial law was declared in Hunan. The political scene rapidly altered. One day a revolutionary appeared in the middle school and made a stirring speech with the permission of the principal. 7 or 8 students arose in the assembly and supported him with vigorous denunciation of the Manchus and calls for action to establish the republic. Everyone listened with complete attention. Not a sound was heard as the orator of the revolution, one of the officials of Li Yuanhong, spoke before the excited students. 4 or 5 days after hearing this speech, I determined to join the revolutionary army of Li Yuanhong. I decided to go to Hankou with several other friends, and we collected some money from our classmates. Having heard that the streets of Hankou were very wet and that it was necessary to wear rain shoes, I went to borrow some from a friend in the army who was quartered outside the city. I was stopped by the garrison guards. The place had become very active. The soldiers had for the first time been furnished with bullets, and they were pouring into the streets. Rebels were approaching the city along the Canton-Hankou Railway, and fighting had begun. A big battle occurred outside of the city walls of Changsha. There was, at the same time, an insurrection within the city, and the gates were stormed and taken by Chinese labourers. Through one of the gates I re-entered the city. Then I stood on a high place and watched the battle, until at last I saw the Han flag raised over the Yamen. It was a white banner with the character Han on it. I returned to my school to find it under military guard. On the following day, a Dudu government was organized. 2 prominent members of the Gelao Hui, the Elder Brother Society, were made Dudu and Vice Dudu. These were Chao Da-feng and Qian Zuoxing, respectively. The new government was established in the former buildings of the Provincial Advisory Council, whose chief had been Dan Yankai, who was dismissed. The council itself was abolished. Among the Manchu documents found by the revolutionaries were some copies of a petition begging for the opening of Parliament. The original had been written in blood by Xu Deli, who is now Commissioner of Education in the Soviet government. Xu had cut off the end of his finger as a demonstration of sincerity and determination, and his petition began, begging that Parliament be opened. I bid farewell to the provincial delegates of Beijing by cutting my finger. The new Dudu and Vice Dudu did not last long. They were not bad men and had some revolutionary intentions, but they were poor and represented the interests of the oppressed. The landlords and the merchants felt dissatisfied with them. Not many days later, when I went to call on a friend, I saw their corpses lying in the street. Dan Yuankai had organized a revolt against them as representative of the Hunan landlords and militarists. Many students were now joining the army. A student army had been organized, and among these students was Dang Shengzhi. I did not like the student army. I considered the basis of it too confused. I decided to join the regular army instead and help complete the revolution. The Qing Emperor had not yet abdicated, and there was a period of struggle. My salary was 7 yuan a month, which is more than I get in the Red Army now, and at the end of this I spent 2 yuan a month on food. I also had to buy water. The soldiers had to carry water in from outside the city, but I, being a student, could not condescend to carrying and bought it from the water peddlers. The rest of my wages were spent on newspapers, of which I became an avid reader. Among journals then dealing with the revolution was the Qiangjiang Jibao, the Changjiang River Daily News. Socialism was discussed in it, and in these columns I first learned the term. I also discussed socialism, really social reformism, with other students and soldiers. I read some pamphlets written by Jiang Kanghu about socialism and its principles. I wrote enthusiastically to several of my classmates on the subject, but only one of them responded in agreement. There was a Hunan miner in my squad and an ironsmith whom I liked very much. The rest were mediocre, and one was a rascal. I persuaded 2 more students to join the army and came to be on friendly terms with the platoon commander and most of the soldiers. I could write, I knew something about books, and they respected my great learning. I could help by writing letters for them or in other such ways. The outcome of the revolution was not yet decided. The Qing had not wholly given up power, and there was a struggle within the Kuomintang concerning the leadership. It was said in Hunan that further war was inevitable. Several armies were organized against the Manchus and against Yuan Shikai. Among these was the Hunan army, but just as the Hunanese were preparing to move into action, Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai came to an agreement. The scheduled war was called off. North and South were unified, and the Nanjing government was dissolved. Thinking the revolution was over, I resigned from the army and decided to return to my books. I had been a soldier for half a year. I began to read advertisements in the papers. Many schools were then being opened and used this medium to attract new students. I had no special standard for judging schools. I did not know exactly what I wanted to do. An advertisement for a police school caught my eye, and I registered for entrance to it. Before I was examined, however, I read an advertisement of a soap-making school. No tuition was required, board was furnished, and a small salary was promised. It was an attractive and inspiring advertisement. It told of the great social benefits of soap-making, how it would enrich the country and enrich the people. I changed my mind about the police school and decided to become a soap maker. I paid my $1 registration fee here also. Meanwhile, a friend of mine had become a law student, and he urged me to enter his school. I also read an alluring advertisement of this law school, which promised many wonderful things. It promised to teach students all about the law in 3 years, and guaranteed that at the end of this period, they would instantly become mandarins. My friend kept praising the school to me, until finally I wrote to my family, repeated all the promises of the advertisement, and asked them to send me my tuition money. I painted a bright picture for them of my future as a jurist and mandarin. Then I paid $1 to register in the law school and waited to hear from my parents. Fate again intervened in the form of an advertisement from a commercial school. Another friend counselled me that the country was in an economic war, and that what was most needed were economists who could build upon the nation's economy. His argument prevailed, and I spent another $1 to register in this commercial middle school. I actually enrolled there and was accepted. Meanwhile, however, I continued to read advertisements, and one day I read one describing the charms of a higher commercial public school. It was operated by the government. It offered a wide curriculum, and I heard that its instructors were very able men. I decided it would be better to become a commercial expert there, paid my $1 and registered, then wrote my father of my decision. He was pleased. My father readily appreciated the advantages of commercial cleverness. I entered this school and remained for 1 month. The trouble with my new school, I discovered, was that most of the courses were taught in English, and in common with other students, I knew little English. Indeed, scarcely more than the alphabet. An additional handicap was that the school provided no English teacher. Disgusted with this situation, I withdrew from the institution at the end of the month and continued my perusal of the advertisements. My next scholastic adventure was the first provincial middle school. I registered for $1, took the entrance examination, and passed at the head of the list of candidates. It was a big school with many students, and its graduates were numerous. A Chinese teacher there helped me very much. He was attracted to me because of my literary tendency. This teacher lent me a book called the Yu Pi Dong Jian, Chronicles with Imperial Commandments, which contained imperial edicts and critiques by Qianlong. About this time, a government magazine exploded in Changsha. There was a huge fire, and we students found it very interesting. Tons of bullets and shells exploded, and gunpowder made an intense blaze. It was better than firecrackers. About a month later, Dan Yankai was driven out by Yuan Shikai, who now had control of the political machinery of the Republic. Deng Xiangming replaced Dan Yankai, and he set out making arrangements for Yuan's enthronement in an attempted restoration of the monarchy, which speedily failed. I did not like the first middle school. Its curriculum was limited, and its regulations were objectionable. After reading Yuan Pi Dong Jian, I had also come to the conclusion that it would be better for me to read and study alone. After 6 months I left the school and arranged a schedule of education on my own, which consisted of reading every day in the Hunan Provincial Library. I was very regular and conscientious about it, and the half-year I spent in this way I consider to have been extremely valuable to me. I went to the library in the morning when it opened. At noon I paused only long enough to buy and eat 2 rice cakes, which were my daily lunch. I stayed in the library every day reading until it closed. During this period of self-education I read many books, studied world geography and world history. There, for the first time, I saw and studied with great interest a map of the world. I read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and Darwin's Origin of Species, and a book on ethics by John Stuart Mill. I read the works of Rousseau, Spencer's Logic, and a book on law written by Montesquieu. I mixed poetry and romances and the tales of ancient Greece with serious study of history and geography of Russia, America, England, France, and other countries. I was then living in a guild house for natives of the Xiangxiang district. Many soldiers were there also, retired or disbanded men from the district who had no work to do and little money. Students and soldiers were always quarrelling in the guild house, and one night this hostility between them broke out into physical violence. The soldiers attacked and tried to kill the students. I escaped by fleeing to the toilet, where I hid until the fight was over. I had no money then, my family refusing to support me unless I entered school, and since I could no longer live in the guild house, I began looking for a new place to lodge. Meanwhile, I had been thinking seriously about my career, and had about decided that I was best suited for teaching. I had begun reading advertisements again. An attractive announcement of the Hunan Normal School now came to my attention, and I read with interest of its advantages. No tuition required, and cheap board and cheap lodging. 2 of my friends were also urging me to enter. They wanted my help in preparing entrance essays. I wrote of my intention to my family, and I received their consent. I composed essays for my 2 friends and wrote one of my own. All were accepted. In reality, therefore, I was accepted 3 times. I did not then think my act of substituting mine for my friends an immoral one. It was merely a matter of friendship. I was a student in the normal school for 5 years and managed to resist the appeals of all future advertising. Finally, I actually got my degree. Incidents in my life here in the Hunan Provincial First Normal Teachers' School were many, and during this period my political ideas began to take shape. Here also I acquired my first experiences in social action. There were many regulations in the new school, and I agreed with very few of them. For one thing, I was opposed to the required courses in natural science. I wanted to specialize in social sciences. Natural sciences did not especially interest me, and I did not study them, so I got poor marks in most of these courses. Most of all, I hated a compulsory course in still life drawing. I thought it extremely stupid. I used to think of the simplest subjects possible to draw, finish up quickly, and leave the class. I remember once drawing a picture of the half-sun, half-rock, which I represented by a straight line with a semicircle over it. Another time, during an examination in drawing, I contented myself with making an oval. I called it an egg. I got 40 in drawing and failed. Fortunately, my marks in social sciences were all excellent, and they balanced my poor grades in these other classes. A Chinese teacher here, whom the students nicknamed Yuan the Big Beard, ridiculed my writing and called it the work of a journalist. He despised Liang Qichao, who had been my model, and considered him half-literate. I was obliged to alter my style. I studied the writings of Han Yu, and mastered the old classical phraseology. Thanks to Yuan the Big Beard, therefore, I can today still turn out a passable classical essay if required. The teacher who made the strongest impression on me was Yang Zhangji, a returned student from England, with whose life I was later to become intimately related. He taught ethics. He was an idealist and a man of high moral character. He believed in his ethics very strongly and tried to imbue his students with the desire to become just, moral, virtuous men, useful in society. Under his influence I read a book on ethics, translated by Cai Yuanbei, and was inspired to write an essay which I titled The Energy of the Mind. I was then an idealist, and my essay was highly praised by Professor Yang Zhangji from his idealist viewpoint. He gave me a mark of 100 for it. A teacher named Dang used to give me old copies of Minbao, the People's Journal, and I read them with keen interest. I learned from them about the activities and the program of the Dongmao Hui. One day I read a copy of the Minbao containing a story about 2 Chinese students who were traveling across China and had reached Daxianlu on the edge of Tibet. This inspired me very much. I wanted to follow their example, but I had no money and thought I should first try out traveling in Hunan. The next summer I set out across the province by foot, and journeyed through 5 counties. I was accompanied by a student named Xiao Yu. We walked through these 5 counties without using a single copper. The peasants fed us and gave us a place to sleep. Wherever we went, we were kindly treated and welcomed. This fellow, Xiao Yu, with whom I travelled, later became a Kuomintang official in Nanjing under Yi Beiqi, who was then president of the Hunan Normal School. Yi Beiqi became a high official at Nanjing and had Xiao Yu appointed to the office of custodian of the Beijing Palace Museum. Xiao sold some of the most valuable treasures in the museum and absconded with the funds in 1934. Feeling expansive and the need for a few intimate companions, I one day inserted an advertisement in a Changsha paper inviting young men interested in patriotic work to make contact with me. I specified youths who were hardened and determined and ready to make sacrifices for their country. To this advertisement I received 3 1/2 replies. One was from Lu Jianglong, who later was to join the Communist Party and afterwards to betray it. 2 others were from young men who later were to become ultra-reactionaries. The half reply came from a non-committal youth named Li San. Li listened to all I had to say, and then went away without making any definite proposals himself, and our friendship never developed. But gradually I did build up a group of students around myself, and the nucleus was formed of what later was to become a society that was to have a widespread influence on the affairs and destiny of China. It was a serious-minded little group of men, and they had no time to discuss trivialities. Everything they did or said must have a purpose. They had no time for love or romance, and considered the times too critical and the need for knowledge too urgent to discuss women or personal matters. I was not interested in women. My parents had married me when I was 14 to a girl of 20, but I had never lived with her and never subsequently did. I did not consider her my wife, and at this time gave little thought to her. Quite aside from the discussions of feminine charm, which usually play an important role in the lives of young men of this age, my companions even rejected talk of ordinary matters of daily life. I remember once being in the house of a youth who began to talk to me about buying some meat, and in my presence called in his servant and discussed the matter with him, then ordered him to buy a piece. I was annoyed and did not see that fellow again. My friends and I preferred to talk only of large matters, the nature of men, of human society, of China, the world, and the universe. We also became ardent physical culturists. In the winter holidays we tramped through the fields, up and down mountains, along city walls and across the streams and rivers. If it rained we took off our shirts and called it a rain bath. When the sun was hot we also doffed shirts and called it a sun bath. In the spring winds we shouted that this was a new sport called wind bathing. We slept in the open when frost was already falling, and even in November swam in the cold rivers. All this went on under the title of body training. Perhaps it helped much to build the physique which I was to need so badly later on in my many marches back and forth across South China, and on the long march from Jiangxi to the northwest. I built up a wide correspondence with many students and friends in other towns and cities. Gradually I began to realize the necessity for a more closely knit organization. In 1917, with some other friends, I helped to found the Xinmin Xuehui. It had from 70 to 80 members, and of these many were later to become famous names in Chinese communism and in the history of the Chinese Revolution. Among the better-known communists who were in the Xinmin Xuehui was Li Weihan, now secretary of the Party Organization Committee, Xia Xi, now in the Second Front Red Army, He Shuheng, who became High Judge of the Supreme Court in the Central Soviet regions and was later killed by Chiang Kai-shek in 1935, Guo Liang, a famous labor organizer, killed by General He Jian in 1930, Xiao Zhuzhang, a writer now in Soviet Russia, Tsai He-sen, a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, killed by Chiang Kai-shek in 1927, Yue Liyun, who became a member of the Central Committee and later betrayed to the Kuomintang and became a capitalist trade union organizer, and Xiao Chen, a prominent party leader, one of the 6 signers of the original agreement for the formation of the party, who died not long ago from illness. The majority of the members of the Xinmin Xuehui were killed in the counter-revolution of 1927. Another society that was formed about that time and resembled the Xinmin Xuehui was the Social Welfare Society of Hubei. Many of its members also later became communists. Among them was Yun Daiying, who was later killed during the counter-revolution by Chiang Kai-shek. Lin Biao, now president of the Red Army University, was a member. And so was Zhang Hao, now in charge of the work among the white troops, those taken prisoner by the Reds. In Beijing there was a society called Hu She, some of whose members later became Reds. Elsewhere in China, notably in Shanghai, Hangzhou, Hankou, and Tianjin, radical societies were organized by the militant youth then beginning to assert an influence on Chinese politics. Most of these societies were organized more or less under the influences of Xinqingnian, New Youth, the famous magazine of the literary Renaissance edited by Chen Duxiu. I began to read this magazine while I was a student in the normal school and admired the articles of Hu Shi and Chen Duxiu very much. They became for a while my models, replacing Liang Qichao and Kang Yuwei, whom I had already discarded. At this time my mind was a curious mixture of ideas of liberalism, democratic reformism, and utopian socialism. I had somewhat vague passions about 19th century democracy, utopianism, and old-fashioned liberalism, and I was definitely anti-militarist and anti-imperialist. I had entered the normal school in 1912. I was graduated in 1918. 3. Prelude to Revolution. During Mao's recollections of his past, I noticed that there was an auditor at least as interested as I was, He Zuzhen, his wife. Many of the facts he told about himself and the communist movement she had evidently never heard before, and this was true of most of Mao's comrades in Bao'an. Later on, when I gathered biographical notes from the other Red leaders, their colleagues often crowded around interestedly to listen to the stories for the first time. Although they had all fought together for years, very often they knew nothing of each other's pre-communist days, which they had tended to regard as a kind of Dark Ages period, one's real life beginning only when one became a communist. It was another night, and Mao sat cross-legged, leaning across his dispatch boxes. He lit a cigarette from a candle and took up the thread of the story where he had left off the evening before. During my years in normal school in Changsha, I had spent altogether only $160, including my numerous registration fees. Of this amount, I must have used a third for newspapers, because regular subscriptions cost me about $1 a month, and I often bought books and journals on the newsstands. My father cursed me for this extravagance. He called it wasted money on wasted paper. But I had acquired the newspaper reading habit, and from 1911 to 1927, when I climbed up Qinggangshan, I never stopped reading the daily papers of Beijing, Shanghai, and Hunan. In my last year in school, my mother died, and more than ever, I lost interest in returning home. I decided that summer to go to Beijing. Many students from Hunan were planning trips to France to study under the Work and Learn scheme which France used to recruit young Chinese in her cause during the World War. Before leaving China, these students planned to study French in Beijing. I helped organize the movement, and in the groups who went abroad were many students from Hunan Normal School, most of whom were later to become famous radicals. Xu Deli was influenced by the movement also, and when he was over 40, he left his professorship at Hunan Normal School and went to France. He did not become a communist, however, till 1927. I accompanied some of the Hunanese students to Beijing. However, although I had helped organize the movement and it had the support of the Xianmen I did not want to go to Europe. I felt that I did not know enough about my own country, and that my time could be more profitably spent in China. Those students who had decided to go to France studied French then from Li Shizong, who is now the president of the Zhongfa Sino-French University. But I did not. I had other plans. Beijing seemed very expensive to me. I had reached the capital by borrowing from friends, and when I arrived I had to look for work at once. Yang Zhangqi, my former ethics teacher at the normal school, had become a professor at Beijing National University. I appealed to him for help in finding a job, and he introduced me to the university librarian. He was Li Dachao, who later became a founder of the Communist Party in China, and was afterwards executed by Jiang Zuolin. Li Dachao gave me work as an assistant librarian, for which I was paid the generous sum of $8 a month. My office was so low that people avoided me. One of my tasks was to register the names of people who came to read newspapers, but to most of them I didn't exist as a human being. Among those who came to read, I recognized the names of famous leaders of the Renaissance movement, men like Fu Xiunian, Luo Jialun, and others, in whom I was intensely interested. I tried to begin conversations with them on political and cultural subjects, but they were very busy men. They had no time to listen to an assistant librarian speaking Southern dialect. But I wasn't discouraged. I joined the Society of Philosophy and the Journalism Society in order to be able to attend classes in the university. In the Journalism Society, I met fellow students like Chen Gongbo, who is now a high official in Nanjing, Dan Pingxian, who later became a communist and still later a member of the so-called Third Party, and Shao Biaobing. Shao especially helped me very much. He was a lecturer in the Journalism Society, a liberal, and a man of fervent idealism and fine character. He was killed by Jiang Zuolin in 1926. While I was working in the library, I also met Zhang Guodao, now vice chairman of the Soviet government, Kang Pei-zhen, who later joined the Ku Klux Klan in California, and Duan Xipeng, now vice minister of education in Nanjing. And here also I met and fell in love with Yang Kaihui. She was the daughter of my former ethics teacher, Yang Zhangqi, who had made a great impression on me in my youth, and who afterwards was a genuine friend in Beijing. My interest in politics continued to increase, and my mind turned more and more radical. I have told you of the background for this, but just now I was still confused, looking for a road, as we say. I read some pamphlets on anarchy and was much influenced by them. With a student named Zhu Xunbei, who used to visit me, I often discussed anarchism and its possibilities in China. At that time I favoured many of its proposals. My own living quarters in Beijing were quite miserable, but in contrast the beauty of the old capital was a vivid and living compensation. I stayed in a place called Sanyanjing, 3 Eyes, in a little room which held 7 other people. When we were all packed fast on the Kang, there was scarcely room enough for any of us to breathe. I used to have to warn people on each side of me when I wanted to turn over. But in the parks and the old palace grounds I saw the early northern spring. I saw the white plum blossoms flower while the ice still held solid over Beihai, a large park in Beijing. I saw the willows over Beihai with the ice crystals hanging from them and remembered the description of the scene by the Tang poet Zhen Chang, who wrote about Beihai's winter-jeweled trees looking like 10,000 peach trees blossoming. The innumerable trees of Beijing aroused my wonder and admiration. Early in 1919 I went to Shanghai with the students bound for France. I had a ticket only to Tianjin, and I did not know how I was to get any further, but as the Chinese proverb says, heaven will not delay a traveller. and a fortunate loan of 10 yuan from a fellow student who had got some money from the Auguste Comte school in Beijing enabled me to buy a ticket as far as Bukou. On the way to Nanjing, I stopped at Zhou and visited Confucius's grave. I saw the small stream where Confucius's disciples bathed their feet, and the little town where the sage lived as a child. He is supposed to have planted a famous tree near the historic temple dedicated to him, and I saw that. I also stopped by the river where Yan Hui, one of Confucius's famous disciples, had once lived, and I saw the birthplace of Mencius. On this trip I climbed Taishan, the sacred mountain of Shandong, where General Feng Yuxiang retired and wrote his patriotic scrolls. But when I reached Pukou, I was once again without a copper and without a ticket. Nobody had any money to lend me. I did not know how I was to get out of town. But the worst of the tragedy happened when a thief stole my only pair of shoes. Ayah, what was I to do? But again, heaven will not delay a traveller, and I had a very good piece of luck. Outside the railway station I met an old friend from Hunan, and he proved to be my good angel. He lent me money for a pair of shoes, and enough to buy a ticket to Shanghai. Thus I safely completed my journey, keeping an eye on my new shoes. At Shanghai I found that a good sum had been raised to help send the students to France, and an allowance had been provided to help me return to Hunan. I saw my friends off on the steamer, and then set out for Changsha. During my first trip to the north, as I remember it, I made these excursions. I walked around the lake of Dongting, and I circled the wall of Baodingfu. I walked on the ice of the Gulf of Beihai. I walked around the wall of Suzhou, famous in the Sangguo, 3 kingdoms, and around Nanjing's wall, also famous in history. Finally I climbed Taishan and visited Confucius's grave. These seemed to me then accomplishments worth adding to my adventures and walking tours in Hunan. When I returned to Changsha, I took a more direct role in politics. After the May 4th movement, I had devoted most of my time to student political activities, and I was editor of the Xiang River Review, the Hunan students' paper, which had a great influence on the student movement in South China. In Changsha, I helped found the Wenhua Shuhui, the Cultural Book Society, an association for study of modern cultural and political tendencies. This society, and more especially the Xinmin Xuehui, were violently opposed to Chang Qingyao, then Du Zhen of Hunan, and a vicious character. We led a general student strike against Zhang, demanding his removal, and sent delegations to Beijing and to the southwest, where Sun Yat-sen was then active, to agitate against him. In retaliation for the students' opposition, Chang Qingyao suppressed the Xiang River Review. After this, I went to Beijing to represent the New People's Student Society and organize an anti-militarist movement there. The society broadened its fight against Chang Qingyao into a general anti-militarist agitation, and I became head of a news agency to promote this work. In Hunan, the movement was rewarded with some success. Chang Qingyao was overthrown by Dan Yankai, and a new regime was established in Changsha. About this time, the society began to divide into 2 groups, a right and a left wing, the left wing insisting on a program of far-reaching social and economic and political changes. I went to Shanghai for the second time in 1919. There, once more, I saw Chen Duxiu. I had first met him in Beijing, when I was at Beijing National University, and he had influenced me perhaps more than anyone else. I also met Hu Shi at the time, having called on him to try to win his support for the Hunanese student struggle. In Shanghai, I discussed with Chen Duxiu our plans for a League of Reconstruction of Hunan. Then I returned to Changsha and began to organize it. I took a place as a teacher there, meanwhile continuing my activity in the New People's Study Society. The society had a program then for the independence of Hunan, meaning really autonomy. Disgusted with the northern government and believing that Hunan could modernize more rapidly if freed from connections with Beijing, our group agitated for separation. I was then a strong supporter of America's Monroe Doctrine and the Open Door. Dan Yankai was driven out of Hunan by a militarist called Chao Hengdi, who utilized the Hunan independence movement for his own ends. He pretended to support it, advocating the idea of a united autonomous states of China, but as soon as he got power, he suppressed the democratic movement with great energy. Our group had demanded equal rights for men and women and representative government, and in general approval of a platform for a bourgeois democracy. We openly advocated these reforms in our paper, the New Hunan. We led an attack on the provincial parliament, the majority of whose members were landlords and gentry appointed by the militarists. This struggle ended in our pulling down the scrolls and banners, which were full of nonsensical and extravagant phrases. The attack on the parliament was considered a big incident in Hunan and frightened the rulers. However, when Chao Hengdi seized control, he betrayed all the ideas he had supported, and especially he violently suppressed all demands for democracy. Our society therefore turned the struggle against him. I remember an episode in 1920 when the Ximinxue organized a demonstration to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of the Russian October Revolution. It was suppressed by the police. Some of the demonstrators had attempted to raise the red flag at that meeting, but were prohibited from doing so by the police. The demonstrators pointed out that, according to Article 12 of the Constitution, the people had the right to assemble, organize, and speak, but the police were not impressed. They replied that they were not there to be taught the Constitution, but to carry out the orders of the governor, Zhou Hengdi. From this time on, I became more and more convinced that only mass political power, secured through mass action, could guarantee the realization of dynamic reforms. In the winter of 1920, I organized workers politically for the first time, and began to be guided in this by the influence of Marxist theory and the history of the Russian Revolution. During my second visit to Beijing, I had read much about the events in Russia, and had eagerly sought out what little communist literature was then available in Chinese. 3 books especially deeply carved my mind, and built up in me a faith in Marxism, from which, once I had accepted it as a correct interpretation of history, I did not afterwards waver. These books were the Communist Manifesto, translated by Chen Wangdao, and the first Marxist book ever published in Chinese, Class Struggle by Kautsky, and A History of Socialism by Kirkup. By the summer of 1920, I had become, in theory, and to some extent in action, a Marxist, and from this time on, I considered myself a Marxist. In the same year, I married Yang Kaihui. 4. The Nationalist Period. Mao was now a Marxist, but not a communist, because as yet there did not exist in China an organized communist party. As early as 1919, Chen Duxiu had established contact with the Comintern through Russians living in Beijing, as had Li Dazhao. It was not until the spring of 1920 that Grigory Voyatinsky, an authorized representative of the Communist International, reached Beijing, in the company of Yang Mingchai, a member of the Russian Communist Party who acted as his interpreter. They conferred with Li Dazhao and probably also met members of Li's Society for the Study of Marxist Theory. In the same year, the energetic and persuasive Jan Henricus Sneevliet, a Dutch agent of the Third International, Di Sangguoji in Chinese, came to Shanghai for talks with Chen Duxiu, who was conferring with serious Chinese Marxists there. It was Chen who, in May 1920, summoned a conference that organized a nuclear communist group. Some members of it became, with Li Dazhao's group in Beijing, another group set up in Guangdong by Chen, groups in Shandong and Hubei, and Mao's group in Hunan, conveners of a Shanghai conference the following year that, with the help of Voyatinsky, summoned the first Chinese Communist Party Congress. When one remembered in 1937 that the Chinese Communist Party was still an adolescent in years, its achievements could be regarded as not inconsiderable. It was the strongest communist party in the world outside of Russia, and the only one, with the same exception, that could boast of an army of its own. Another night, and Mao carried on his narrative. In May of 1921, I went to Shanghai to attend the founding meeting of the Chinese Communist Party. In its organization, the leading roles were played by Chen Duxiu and Li Dazhao, both of whom were among the most brilliant intellectual leaders of China. Under Li Dazhao, as assistant librarian at Beijing National University, I had rapidly developed towards Marxism, and Chen Duxiu had been instrumental in my interests in that direction too. I had discussed with Chen on my second visit to Shanghai the Marxist books that I had read, and Chen's own assertions of belief that deeply impressed me at what was probably a critical period of my life. There was only one other Hunanese at that historic meeting, the first National Congress of the party, in Shanghai. Others present were Zhang Guotao, now vice-chairman of the Red Army Military Council, Bao Huisheng, and Zhou Fuhai. Altogether there were 12 of us. In Shanghai, those elected to the Central Committee of the party included Chen Duxiu, Zhang Guotao, Chen Gongbo, Shi Zengdong, now a Nanjing official, Sun Yuanlu, Li Hanchun, killed in Wuhan in 1927, Li Da, and Li Sun, later executed. The following October, the first provincial branch of the party was organized in Hunan, and I became a member of it. Organizations were also established in other provinces and cities. Members in Hubei included Dong Pi Wu, now chairman of the Communist Party school in Bao'an, Xu Baihao, and Shi Yang, executed in 1923. In the Xianxi party was Guo Zhongyu and some famous student leaders. In the party branch of Beijing was Li Dazhao, executed with 19 other Beijing communists in 1927, Deng Zhongxia, executed by Chiang Kai-shek in 1934, Luo Zhonglun, Liu Zhenqing, now a Trotskyite, and others. In Guangdong was Lin Xuhan, now Commissioner of Finance in the Soviet government, and Peng Pai, executed in 1929. Wang Junmei and Deng Enming were among the founders of the Shandong branch. Meanwhile, in France, a Chinese Communist Party had been organized by many of the worker students there, and its founding was almost simultaneous with the beginning of the organization in China. Among the founders of the party, the CYL, was Zhou Enlai, Li Lisan, Xiang Jingwu, the wife of Cai He-sen, Luo Man, Li Weihan, and Cai He-sen were also founders of the French branch. A Chinese party was organized in Germany, but this was somewhat later. Among its members was Cao Yuhan, Zhu De, now commander-in-chief of the Red Army, and Zhang Shengfu, now a professor at Tsinghua University. In Moscow, the founders of the branch were Qiu Pai and others, and in Japan there was Chou Fu Hai. In May 1922, the Hunan Party, of which I was then secretary, had already organized more than 20 trade unions among miners, railway workers, municipal employees, printers, and workers in the government mint. A vigorous labour movement began that winter. The work of the Communist Party was then concentrated mainly on students and workers, and very little was done among the peasants. Most of the big mines were organized, and virtually all the students. There were numerous struggles on both the students' and the workers' fronts. In the winter of 1922, Zhao Hengti, civil governor of Hunan, ordered the execution of 2 Hunanese workers, Huang Ai and Bang Yuanjing, and as a result, a widespread agitation began against him. Huang Ai, one of the workers killed, was a leader of the right-wing labour movement, which had its base in the industrial school students and was opposed to us, but we supported them in this case, and in many other struggles. Anarchists were also influential in the trade unions, which were then organised into an all-Hunan labour syndicate, but we compromised and through negotiation prevented many hasty and useless actions by them. I was sent to Shanghai to help organise the movement against Zhao Hengti. The second Congress of the party was convened in Shanghai that winter, 1922, and I intended to attend. However, I forgot the name of the place where it was to be held, could not find any comrades, and missed it. I returned to Hunan and vigorously pushed the work among the labour unions. That spring there were many strikes for better wages and better treatment in recognition of the labour unions. Most of these were successful. On the 1st of May, a general strike was called in Hunan, and this marked the achievement of unprecedented strength in the labour movement of China. The Third Congress of the Communist Party was held in Guangdong in May 1923, and the historic decision was reached to enter the Kuomintang, cooperate with it, and create a united front against the northern militarists. I went to Shanghai and worked in the central committee of the party. Next spring in 1924, I went to Guangdong and attended the First National Congress of the Kuomintang. In March, I returned to Shanghai and combined my work in the Executive Bureau of the Communist Party with membership in the Executive Bureau of the Kuomintang of Shanghai. The other members of this bureau then were Wang Jingwei, later Premier in Nanjing, and Hu Hanming, with whom I worked in coordinating the measures of the Communist Party in the Kuomintang. That summer, the Huangpu Military Academy was set up. Galin became its advisor, other Soviet advisors arrived from Russia, and the Kuomintang Communist Party Entente began to assume the proportions of a nationwide revolutionary movement. The following winter I returned to Hunan for a rest. I had become ill in Shanghai, but while in Hunan I organized the nucleus of the greater peasant movement of that province. Formerly I had not fully realized the degree of class struggle among the peasantry, but after the May 30th incident in 1925, and during the great wave of political activity which followed it, the Hunanese peasantry became very militant. I left my home where I had been resting and began a rural organizational campaign. In a few months we had formed more than 20 peasant unions, and had aroused the wrath of the landlords who demanded my arrest. Zhao Hengti sent troops after me, and I fled to Guangdong. I reached there just at the time the Huangpu students had defeated Yang Ximing, the Yunnan militarist, and Lu Zhengwai, the Guangxi militarist, and an air of great optimism pervaded the city and the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek had been made commander of the First Army, and Wang Jingwei chairman of the government, following the death of Sun Yat-sen in Beijing. I became editor of the Political Weekly, a publication of the propaganda department of the Kuomintang, headed by Wang Jingwei. It later played a very active role in attacking and discrediting the right wing of the Kuomintang, led by Taiji Tao. I was also put in charge of training organizers for the Peasant Movement Training Institute, and established a course for this purpose which was attended by representatives from 21 different provinces and included students from Inner Mongolia. Not long after my arrival in Guangdong, I became chief of the Agitprop department of the Kuomintang and candidate for the Central Committee. Lin Xiuhan was then chief of the Peasant Department of the Kuomintang, and Tan Pingshan, another communist, was chief of the Workers' Department. I was writing more and more and assuming special responsibilities in peasant work in the Communist Party. On the basis of my study and of my work in organizing the Hunan peasants, I wrote 2 pamphlets, one called Analysis of Classes in Chinese Society, and the other called The Class Basis of Chao Heng Ti and the Tasks Before Us. Chen Duxiu opposed the opinions expressed in the first one, which advocated a radical land policy and vigorous organization of the peasantry under the Communist Party, and he refused its publication in the Communist central organs. It was later published in Zhongguo Nongmin, the Chinese peasant, of Guangdong, and in the magazine Zhongguo Qingnian, Chinese Youth. The second thesis was published as a pamphlet in Hunan. I began to disagree with Chen's right opportunist policy about this time, and we gradually drew further apart, although the struggle between us did not come to a climax until 1927. I continued to work in the Kuomintang in Guangdong until about the time Chiang Kai-shek attempted his first coup d'etat there in March 1926. After the reconciliation of left and right-wing Kuomintang and the reaffirmation of Kuomintang communist solidarity, I went to Shanghai in the spring of 1926. The second Congress of the Kuomintang was held in May of that year, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. In Shanghai, I directed the peasant department of the Communist Party, and from there was sent to Hunan as inspector of the peasant movement for both the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. Meanwhile, under the united front of the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, the historic Northern Expedition began in the autumn of 1926. In Hunan, I inspected peasant organization and political conditions in 5 xian, Changsha, Liling, Xiangdan, Huangshan, and Xiangxiang, and made my report on an investigation into the peasant movement in Hunan to the Central Committee, urging the adoption of a new line in the peasant movement. Early next spring, when I reached Wuhan, an interprovincial meeting of peasants was held, and I attended it and discussed the proposals of my thesis, which carried recommendations for a widespread redistribution of land. At this meeting were Peng Pai and Fang Zhimian, and 2 Russian communists, Yolk and Volin, among others. A resolution was passed adopting my proposal for submission to the 5th Congress of the Communist Party. The Central Committee, however, rejected it. When the 5th Congress of the party was convened in Wuhan in May 1927, the party was still under the domination of Chen Duxiu, although Chiang Kai-shek had already led the counter-revolution and began his attacks on the Communist Party in Shanghai and Nanjing. Chen was still for moderation and concessions to the Wuhan Kuomintang. Overriding all opposition, he followed a right opportunist petty bourgeois policy. I was very dissatisfied with the party policy then, especially toward the peasant movement. I think today that if the peasant movement had been more thoroughly organized and armed for a class struggle against the landlords, the Soviets would have had an earlier and far more powerful development throughout the whole country. But Chen Duxiu violently disagreed. He did not understand the role of the peasantry in the revolution and greatly underestimated its possibilities at this time. Consequently, the 5th Congress, held on the eve of the crisis of the Great Revolution, failed to pass an adequate land program. My opinions, which called for rapid intensification of the agrarian struggle, were not even discussed, for the Central Committee, also dominated by Chen Duxiu, refused to bring them up for consideration. The Congress dismissed the land problem by defining a landlord as a peasant who owns over 500 mo of land, a wholly inadequate and unpractical basis on which to develop the class struggle, and quite without consideration of the special character of land economy in China. Following the Congress, however, an all-China Peasants' Union was organized, and I became the first president of it. By the spring of 1927, the peasant movement in Hubei, Jiangxi, and Fujian, and especially in Hunan, had developed a startling militancy, despite the lukewarm attitude of the Communist Party to it, and the definite alarm of the Kuomintang. High officials and army commanders began to demand its suppression, describing the Peasants' Union as a vagabond union, and its actions and demands as excessive. Chen Duxiu had withdrawn me from Hunan, holding me responsible for certain happenings there and violently opposing my ideas. In April, the counter-revolutionary movement had begun in Nanjing and Shanghai, and a general massacre of organized workers had taken place under Chiang Kai-shek. The same measures were carried out in Guangdong. In May 1921, the Xuguoxiang uprising occurred in Hunan. Scores of peasants and workers were killed by the reactionaries. Shortly afterwards, the left Kuomintang at Wuhan annulled its agreement with the communists and expelled them from the Kuomintang and from government, which quickly ceased to exist. Many communist leaders were now ordered by the party to leave the country, go to Russia or Shanghai or places of safety. I was ordered to go to Sichuan. I persuaded Chen Duxiu to send me to Hunan instead, as secretary of the provincial committee. But after 10 days, he ordered me to return at once, accusing me of organizing an uprising against Tang Shengzhi, then in command at Wuhan. The affairs of the party were now in a chaotic state. Nearly everyone was opposed to Chen Duxiu's leadership and his opportunist line. The collapse of the Entente at Wuhan soon afterwards brought about his downfall. 5. The Soviet Movement. A conversation I had with Mao Zedong concerning the much disputed events of the spring of 1927 seemed to me of sufficient interest to mention here. It was not part of his autobiography as he had told it to me, but it was important to note as a personal reflection on what was a turning point experience in the life of every Chinese communist. I asked Mao whom he considered most responsible for the failure of the Communist Party in 1927, the defeat of the Wuhan coalition government, and the whole triumph of the Nanjing dictatorship. Mao placed the greatest blame on Chen Duxiu, whose wavering opportunism deprived the party of decisive leadership and a direct line of its own at the moment when further compromise clearly meant catastrophe. After Chen, the man he held responsible for the defeat was Mikhail Markovich Borodin, chief Russian political advisor, who was answerable directly to the Soviet Politburo. Mao explained that Borodin had completely reversed his position, favouring a radical land redistribution in 1926, but strongly opposing it in 1927, without any logical support for his vacillations. Borodin stood just a little to the right of Chen Duxiu, Mao said, and was ready to do everything to please the bourgeoisie, even to the disarming of the workers, which he finally ordered. M.N. Roy, the Indian delegate to the Comintern, stood a little to the left of both Chen and Borodin, but he only stood, he said. He could talk, according to Mao, and he talked too much, without offering any method of realization. Mao thought that, objectively, Roy had been a fool, Borodin a blunderer, and Chen an unconscious traitor. Chen was really frightened of the workers, and especially of the armed peasants. Confronted at last with the reality of armed insurrection, he completely lost his senses. He could no longer see clearly what was happening, and his petty bourgeois instincts betrayed him into a panic and defeat. Mao asserted that Chen was, at that time, complete dictator of the Chinese party, and took vital decisions without even consulting the Central Committee. He did not show other party leaders the orders of the Comintern, according to Mao, or even discuss them with us. But in the end it was Roy who forced the break with the Kuomintang. The Comintern sent a message to Borodin ordering the party to begin a limited confiscation of the landlord's land. Roy got hold of a copy of it and promptly showed it to Wang Jingwei, then chairman of the left Kuomintang government at Wuhan. The result of this caprice is well known. The communists were expelled from the Kuomintang by the Wuhan regime, which soon afterwards collapsed, having lost the support of regional warlords who now sought safety and compromises with Chiang Kai-shek. Borodin and other Comintern agents fled to Russia and arrived there in time to see the opposition crushed and Trotsky's permanent revolution discredited, while Stalin set out in earnest to build socialism in one country. Mao did not think that the counter-revolution would have been defeated in 1927, even if the Communist Party had carried out a more aggressive policy of land confiscation and created communist armies from among the workers and the peasants before the split with the Kuomintang. But the Soviets could have got an immense start in the south, and a base in which, afterwards, they would never have been destroyed. In his narrative of himself, Mao had now reached the beginning of the Soviets, which arose from the wreckage of the revolution, and struggled to build a victory out of defeat. He continued, On August 1, 1927, the 20th Army under He Lang and Ye Ding, and in cooperation with Zhou De, led the historic Nanchang Uprising, and the beginning of what was to become the Red Army was organized. A week later, on August 7th, an extraordinary meeting, or an emergency conference of the Central Committee of the party deposed Chen Duxiu as secretary. I had been a member of the political bureau of the party since the third conference at Guangdong in 1924, and was active in this decision, and among the 10 other members present in the meeting were Cai He-sen, Peng Pai, Zhang Guotao, and Chu Qiupai. A new line was adopted by the party, and all hope of cooperation with the Kuomintang was given up for the present, as it had already become hopelessly the tool of imperialism and could not carry out the responsibilities of a democratic revolution. The long, open struggle for power now began. I was sent to Changsha to organize the movement which later became known as the Autumn Harvest Uprising. My program there called for the realization of 5 points. 1. The complete severance of the provincial party from the Kuomintang. 2. Organization of a peasant worker revolutionary army. 3. Confiscation of the property of small and middle as well as great landlords. 4. Setting up the power of the Communist Party in Hunan, independent of the Kuomintang. And 5. Organization of Soviets. The 5th point at that time was opposed by the Comintern, and not till later did it advance it as a slogan. In September we had already succeeded in organizing a widespread uprising through the peasant unions of Hunan, and the first units of a peasant worker army were formed. Recruits were drawn from 3 principal sources: the peasantry itself, the Hanyang miners, and the insurrectionist troops of the Kuomintang. This early military force of the revolution was called the 1st Division of the 1st Peasants and Workers' Army. The 1st Regiment was formed from the Hanyang miners. A 2nd was created among the peasant guards in Pingjiang, Liuyang, Liling, and 2 other xian of Hunan, and a 3rd from part of the garrison forces of Wuhan, which had revolted against Wang Jingwei. This army was organized with the sanction of the Hunan Provincial Committee, but the general program of the Hunan Committee of our army was opposed by the Central Committee of the party, which seemed, however, to have adopted a policy of wait-and-see rather than of active opposition. While I was organizing the Red Army and travelling between the Hanyang miners and the peasant guards, I was captured by some Mintuan working with the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang terror was then at its height, and hundreds of suspected Reds were being shot. I was ordered to be taken to the Mintuan headquarters, where I was to be killed. Borrowing several tens of dollars from a comrade, however, I attempted to bribe the escort to free me. The ordinary soldiers were mercenaries, with no special interest in seeing me killed, and they agreed to release me, but the subaltern in charge refused to permit it. I therefore decided to attempt to escape, but had no opportunity to do so until I was within about 200 yards of the Mintuan headquarters. At that point I broke loose and ran into the fields. I reached a high place above a pond with some tall grass surrounding it, and there I hid until sunset. The soldiers pursued me and forced some peasants to help them search. Many times they came very near, once or twice so close that I could have almost touched them, but somehow I escaped discovery, although half a dozen times I gave up hope, feeling certain I would be recaptured. At last, when it was dusk, they abandoned the search. At once I set off across the mountains, travelling all night. I had no shoes and my feet were badly bruised. On the road I met a peasant who befriended me, gave me shelter and later guided me to the next district. I had $7 with me, and used this to buy some shoes, an umbrella, and food. When at last I reached the peasant guards safely, I had only 2 coppers in my pocket. With the establishment of the new division, I became chairman of its party front committee, and Yu Shatou, a commander of the garrison troops at Wuhan, became commander of the First Army. Yu, however, had been more or less forced to take the position by the attitude of his men. Soon afterwards he deserted and joined the Kuomintang. He is now working for Chiang Kai-shek at Nanjing. The little army leading the peasant uprising moved southward through Hunan. It had to break its way through thousands of Kuomintang troops and fought many battles with many reverses. Discipline was poor, political training was at a low level, and many wavering elements were among the men and officers. There were many desertions. After Yu Shatou fled, the army was reorganized when it reached Ningdu. Chen Hao was made commander of the remaining troops, about 1 regiment. He too later on betrayed, but many in that first group remained loyal to the end, and are today still in the Red Army, men such as Luo Ronghuan, political commissar of the 1st Army Corps, and Yang Li-san, now an army commander. When the little band finally climbed up Jinggangshan, they numbered in all only about 1,000. Because the program of the Autumn Harvest Uprising had not been sanctioned by the Central Committee, because also the First Army had suffered some severe losses, and from the angle of the cities the movement appeared doomed to failure, the Central Committee now definitely repudiated me. I was dismissed from the Politburo, and also from the Party General Front Committee. The Hunan Provincial Committee also attacked us, calling us the Rifle Movement. We nevertheless held our army together at Jinggangshan, feeling certain that we were following the correct line and subsequent events were to vindicate us fully. New recruits were added and the division filled out again. I became its commander. From the winter of 1927 to the autumn of 1928, the 1st Division held its base in Jinggangshan. In November 1927, the First Soviet was set up in Chaling, on the Hunan border, and the first Soviet government was elected. Its chairman was Du Zhongpin. In this Soviet, and subsequently others, we promoted a democratic program with a moderate policy based on slow but regular development. This earned Jinggangshan the recriminations of putschists in the party who were demanding a terrorist policy of raiding and burning and killing of landlords in order to destroy their morale. The First Army Front Committee refused to adopt such tactics and were therefore branded by the hotheads as reformists. I was bitterly attacked by them for not carrying out a more radical policy. 2 former bandit leaders near Jinggangshan, named Wang Zuo and Yuan Wencai, joined the Red Army in the winter of 1927. This increased the strength to about 3 regiments. Wang and Yuan were both made regimental commanders, and I was army commander. These 2 men, although former bandits, had thrown in their forces with the nationalist revolution, and were now ready to fight against the reaction. While I remained on Jinggangshan, they were faithful communists and carried out the orders of the party. Later on, when they were left alone at Jinggangshan, they returned to their bandit habits. Subsequently they were killed by the peasants, by then organized and Sovietized and able to defend themselves. In May of 1928, Zhou arrived at Jinggangshan, and our forces were combined. Together we drew up a plan at the first Maobin conference to establish a 6-xian Soviet area to stabilize and consolidate gradually the communist power in the Hunan, Jiangxi, Guangdong border districts, and, with that as a base, to expand over greater areas. This strategy was in opposition to the recommendations of the party, which had grandiose ideas of rapid expansion. In the army itself, Zhou and I had to fight against two tendencies. First, a desire to advance on Changsha, the capital of Hunan, at once, which we considered adventurism. Second, a desire to withdraw to the south of the Guangdong border, which we regarded as retreatism or capitulationism. Our main tasks, as we saw them, were two: to divide the land and to establish Soviets. We wanted to arm the masses to hasten those processes. Our policy called for free trade with the white areas, generous treatment of captured enemy troops, and in general democratic moderation. A representative meeting, the second Maobin conference, was called in Jinggangshan in the autumn of 1928, and was attended by delegates from Soviet districts north of Jinggangshan. Some division of opinion still existed among party men in the Soviet districts concerning the points mentioned above, and at this meeting differences were thoroughly aired. A minority argued that our future on this basis was narrowly limited, but the majority had faith in the policy, and when a resolution was proposed declaring that the Soviet movement would be victorious, it was easily passed. The party Central Committee, however, had not yet given the movement its sanction. This was not received till the winter of 1928, when they reported the proceedings at the 6th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, held in Moscow, reached Jinggangshan. With the new line adopted at the Congress, Zhou and I were in complete agreement. From that time on, the differences between the leaders of the party and the leaders of the Soviet movement in the agrarian districts disappeared. Party harmony was re-established. Resolutions of the 6th Congress summarized the experience of the 1925 to 1927 revolution and the Nanchang, Guangzhou, and autumn harvest uprisings. It concluded with approval of the emphasis on the agrarian movement. About this time, Red Armies began to appear elsewhere in China. Uprisings had occurred in western and eastern Hubei in the winter of 1927, and these furnished the basis for new Soviet districts. Helong in the west and Xiuhaidong in the east began to form their own worker-peasant armies. The latter's area of operations became the nucleus of the Ouyuan Soviet, to which later on went Xu Xiangjian and Zhang Guotao. Fang Zhimin and Xiao Xubing had also begun a movement along the northeastern frontier of Jiangxi, adjacent to Fujian, in the winter of 1927, and out of this later developed a powerful Soviet base. After the failure of the Guangzhou uprising, Peng Pai had led part of the loyal troops to Hailuo Feng, and there formed the Soviet, which, following a policy of putschism, was soon destroyed. Part of the army, however, emerged from the district under the command of Gu Dazhen, and made connections with Zhou and myself, later on becoming the nucleus of the 11th Red Army. In the spring of 1928, partisans became active in Xinguo and Denggu in Jiangxi, led by Li Wenlong and Li Shaozu. This movement had its base around Jian, and these partisans later became the core of the Third Army, while the district itself became the base of the Central Soviet government. In western Fujian, Soviets were established by Jiang Dingzheng and Hu Beide, who afterwards became a social democrat. During the struggle and adventurism period at Jinggangshan, the First Army had defeated 2 attempts by white troops to retake the mountain. Jinggangshan proved to be an excellent base for a mobile army such as we were building. It had good natural defences and grew enough crops to supply a small army. It had a circuit of about 500 li and was about 80 li in diameter. Locally, it was known otherwise as Da Xiao Wu Jin, Big Little 5 Wells, the real Jinggangshan being a nearby mountain, long deserted, and got its name from 5 main wells on its sides, Da, Xiao, Shang, Xia, and Zhong, or big, small, upper, lower, and middle wells. The 5 villages on the mountain were named after these wells. After the forces of our army combined at Jinggangshan, there was a reorganization, the famous 4th Red Army was created, and Zhou was made commander, while I became political commissar. More troops arrived at Jinggangshan after uprisings and mutinies in He Jian's army in the winter of 1928, and out of these emerged the 5th Red Army, commanded by Peng Dehuai. In addition to Peng, there was Teng Ping, killed in Xunyi, Guizhou, during the Long March, Huang Guonu, killed in Jiangxi in 1931, and Tian Deyuan. Conditions on the mountain with the arrival of so many troops were becoming very bad. The troops had no winter uniforms and food was extremely scarce. For months we lived practically entirely on squash. The soldiers shouted a slogan of their own, "Down with capitalism and eat squash!" for to them capitalism meant landlords and landlords meant squash. Leaving Pengde Huai at Jinggangshan, Zhou De broke through the blockade established by the white troops, and in January 1929, our first sojourn on the embattled mountain ended. The Fourth Army now began a campaign through the south of Jiangxi, which rapidly developed successfully. We established a Soviet in Denggu, and there met and united with local Red troops. Dividing forces, we continued into Yongding, Shangheng, and Longyuan, and established Soviets in all these counties. The existence of militant mass movements prior to the arrival of the Red Army assured our success, and helped to consolidate Soviet power on a stable basis very quickly. The influence of the Red Army now extended through the agrarian mass movement and partisans to several other xian, but the communists did not fully take power there until later on. Conditions in the Red Army began to improve, both materially and politically, but there were still many bad tendencies. Partisanism, for example, was a weakness reflected in the lack of discipline, exaggerated ideas of democracy, and looseness of organization. Another tendency that had to be fought was vagabondage, a disinclination to settle down to the serious tasks of government, a love of movement, change, new experience, and incident. There were also remnants of militarism, with some of the commanders maltreating or even beating the men and discriminating against those they disliked personally, while showing favoritism to others. Many of the weaknesses were overcome after the convening of the Ninth Party Conference of the Fourth Red Army, held in West Fujian in December 1929. Ideas for improvements were discussed, many misunderstandings levelled out, and new plans were adopted, which laid the foundations for a high type of ideological leadership in the Red Army. Prior to this, the tendencies already described were very serious and were utilized by a Trotskyist faction in the party and military leadership to undermine the strength of the movement. A vigorous struggle was now begun against them, and several were deprived of their party positions and army command. Of these, Liu Wenkang, an army commander, was typical. It was found that they had intended to destroy the Red Army by leading it into difficult positions in battles with the enemy, and after several unsuccessful encounters their plans became quite evident. They bitterly attacked our program and everything we advocated. Experience having shown their errors, they were eliminated from responsible positions, and after the Fujian Conference lost their influence. This conference prepared the way for the establishment of the Soviet power in Jiangxi. The following year was marked with some brilliant successes. Nearly the whole of southern Jiangxi fell to the Red Army. The base of the Central Soviet regions had been established. On February the 7th of 1930, an important local conference was called in South Jiangxi to discuss the future program of the Soviets. It was attended by local representatives from the party, the army, and the government. Here the question of the land policy was argued at great length, and the struggle against opportunism led by those opposed to redistribution was overcome. It was resolved to carry out land redistribution and quicken the formation of Soviets. Until then, the Red Army had formed only local and district Soviets. At this conference, it was decided to establish the Jiangxi Provisional Soviet Government. To the new program, the peasants responded with a warm, enthusiastic support, which helped in the months ahead to defeat the extermination campaigns of the Kuomintang armies. 6. Growth of the Red Army. Mao Zedong's account had begun to pass out of the category of personal history, and to sublimate itself somehow intangibly in the career of a great movement in which, though he retained a dominant role, you could not see him clearly as a personality. It was no longer I, but we, no longer Mao Zedong, but the Red Army, no longer a subjective impression of the experiences of a single life, but an objective record by a bystander concerned with the mutations of collective human destiny as the material of history. As his story drew to a close, it became more and more necessary for me to interrogate him about himself. What was he doing at that time? What office did he hold then? What was his attitude in this or that situation? And my questioning generally evoked such references as there are to himself in this last chapter of the narrative. Gradually the Red Army's work with the masses improved, discipline strengthened, and a new technique in organization was developed. The peasantry everywhere began to volunteer to help the revolution. As early as Jinggangshan, the Red Army had imposed 3 simple rules of discipline upon its fighters, and these were prompt obedience to orders, no confiscations whatsoever from the poor peasantry, and prompt delivery directly to the government for its disposal of all goods confiscated from the landlords. After the 1928 conference, the Second Maobing Conference, emphatic efforts to enlist the support of the peasantry were made, and 8 rules were added to the 3 listed above. These were as follows. Replace all doors when you leave a house. The soldiers often used to use the doors to sleep on to keep them off the ground. 2. Return and roll up the straw matting on which you sleep. 3. Be courteous and polite to the people and help them when you can. 4. Return all borrowed articles. 5. Replace all damaged articles. 6. Be honest in all transactions with the peasants. 7. Pay for all articles purchased. 8. Be sanitary, and especially establish latrines a safe distance from people's houses. The last 2 rules were added by Lin Biao. These 8 points were enforced with better and better success, and today are still the code of the Red Soldier, memorized and frequently repeated by him. 3 other duties were taught to the Red Army, as its primary purpose. First, to struggle to the death against the enemy. Second, to arm the masses. Third, to raise money to support the struggle. Early in 1929, several groups of partisans under Li Wenlong and Li Shaozu were reorganized into the Third Red Army, commanded by Wang Gonglu, and with Qian Yi as political commissar. During the same period, part of Zhu Peide's Mintuan mutinied and joined the Red Army. They were led to the communist camp by a Kuomintang commander, Luo Binghui, who was disillusioned about the Kuomintang and wanted to join the Red Army. He is now commander of the 32nd Red Army of the Second Front Army. From the Fujian partisans and nucleus of regular Red troops, the 12th Red Army was created under the command of Wu Zhanghao, with Tan Chenlin as political commissar. Wu was later killed in battle and replaced by Luo Binghui. It was at this time that the 1st Army Corps was organized, with Zhu De as a commander and myself as political commissar. It was composed of the 3rd Army, the 4th Army commanded by Lin Biao, and the 12th Army under Luo Binghui. Party leadership was vested in a front committee, of which I was chairman. There were already more than 10,000 men in the 1st Army Corps then, organized into 10 divisions. Besides this main force, there were many locals and independent regiments, Red Guards and partisans. Red tactics, apart from the political basis of the movement, explained much of the successful military development. At Jingangshan, 4 slogans had been adopted, and these gave the clue to the methods of partisan warfare used, out of which the Red Army grew. The slogans were: 1. When the enemy advances, we retreat. 2. When the enemy halts and encamps, we trouble them. 3. When the enemy seeks to avoid battle, we attack. 4. When the enemy retreats, we pursue. These slogans, of 4 characters each in Chinese, were at first opposed by many experienced military men who did not agree with the type of tactics advocated. But much experience proved that the tactics were correct. Whenever the Red Army departed from them in general, it did not succeed. Our forces were small, exceeded from 10 to 20 times by the enemy. Our resources and fighting materials were limited, and only by skillfully combining the tactics of maneuvering and guerrilla warfare could we hope to succeed in our struggle against the Kuomintang, fighting from vastly richer and superior bases. The most important single tactic of the Red Army was, and remains, its ability to concentrate its main forces in the attack, and swiftly divide and separate them afterwards. This implied that positional warfare was to be avoided, and every effort made to meet the living forces of the enemy while in movement, and destroy them. On the basis of these tactics, the mobility and the swift, powerful, short attack of the Red Army was developed. In expanding Soviet areas in general, the program of the Red Army favored a wave-like or tidal development, rather than an uneven advance gained by leaps or jumps, and without deep consolidation in the territories gained. The policy was pragmatic, just as were the tactics already described, and grew out of many years of collective military and political experience. These tactics were severely criticized by Li Lisan, who advocated the concentration of all weapons in the hands of the Red Army and the absorption of all partisan groups. He wanted attacks rather than consolidation, advances without securing the rear, sensational assaults on big cities, accompanied by uprisings and extremism. The Li Lisan line dominated the party then, outside Soviet areas, and was sufficiently influential to force acceptance to some extent in the Red Army against the judgment of its field command. One result of it was the attack on Changsha, and another was the advance on Nanchang, but the Red Army refused to immobilize its partisan groups and open up its rear to the enemy during these adventures. In the autumn of 1929, the Red Army moved into northern Jiangxi, attacking and occupying many cities, and inflicting numerous defeats on Kuomintang armies. When within striking distance of Nanchang, the 1st Army Corps turned sharply west and moved on to Changsha. In this drive it met and joined forces with Peng Dehuai, who had already occupied Changsha once, but had been forced to withdraw to avoid being surrounded by vastly superior enemy troops. Peng had been obliged to leave Jingangshan on April 1929, and had carried out operations in southern Jiangxi, resulting in greatly increasing his troops. He rejoined Zhu De and the main forces of the Red Army in Jiujiang in April 1930. and after a conference it was decided that Peng's Third Army should operate on the Jiangxi-Hunan border, while Zhu and I moved into Fujian. It was in June 1930 that the Third Army and the First Army Corps re-established a junction and began the second attack on Changsha. The First and Third Army Corps were combined into the First Front Army, with Zhu as commander-in-chief and myself as political commissar. Under this leadership we arrived outside the walls of Changsha. The Chinese Workers' and Peasants' Revolutionary Committee was organized about this time, and I was elected chairman. The Red Army's influence in Hunan was widespread, almost as much as in Jiangxi. My name was known among the Hunanese peasants, for big rewards were offered for my capture, dead or alive, as well as for Zhu and other Reds. My land in Xiangtan was confiscated by the Kuomintang. My wife and my sister, as well as the wives of my two brothers, Mao Zemin and Mao Zetan, and my own sons, were all arrested by He Jian, the warlord governor. My wife, Kai Hui, and my sister Zeheng were executed. The others were later released. The prestige of the Red Army even extended to my own village in Xiangtan, for I heard the tale that the local peasants believed that I would be soon returning to my native home. When one day an aeroplane passed overhead, they decided it was I. They warned the man, who was then tilling my land, that I had come back to look over my old farm, to see whether or not any trees had been cut. If so, I would surely demand compensation from Chiang Kai-shek, they said. But the second attack on Changsha proved to be a failure. Great reinforcements had been sent to the city, and it was heavily garrisoned. Besides, new troops were pouring into Hunan in September to attack the Red Army. Only one important battle occurred during the siege, and in it the Red Army eliminated 2 brigades of enemy troops. It could not, however, take the city of Changsha, and after a few weeks withdrew to Jiangxi. This failure helped to destroy the Lili-San line and saved the Red Army from what would probably have been a catastrophic attack on Wuhan, which Li was demanding. The main tasks of the Red Army then were the recruiting of new troops, the Sovietization of new rural areas, and above all the consolidation under thorough Soviet power of such areas as already had fallen to the Red Army. For such a program, the attacks on Changsha were not necessary and had an element of adventure in them. Had the first occupation been undertaken as a temporary action, however, and not with the idea of attempting to hold the city and set up a state power there, its effects might have been considered beneficial, for the reaction produced on the national revolutionary movement was very great. The error was a strategic and tactical one in attempting to make a base of Changsha while the Soviet power was still not consolidated behind it. To interrupt Mao's narrative for a moment, Lili-San was a Hunanese and a returned student from France. He divided time in Shanghai and Hankou, where the Communist Party had underground headquarters. Only after 1930 was the Central Committee transferred to the Soviet districts. Li dominated the Chinese Party from 1929 to 1930, when he was removed from the Politburo and sent to Moscow. Like Chen Duxiu, Lili-San lacked faith in the rural Soviets, and urged that strong aggressive tactics be adopted against the strategic big capitals like Changsha, Wuhan, and Nanchang. He wanted a terror in the villages to demoralize the gentry, a mighty offensive by the workers, risings and strikes to paralyze the enemy in his bases, and flank attacks in the north from Outer Mongolia and Manchuria backed by the USSR. To continue. But Lili-San overestimated both the military strength of the Red Army at that time and the revolutionary factors in the national political scene. He believed that the revolution was nearing success and would shortly have power over the entire country. This belief was encouraged by the long and exhausting civil war then proceeding between Fang Yuxiang and Chiang Kai-shek, which made the outlook seem highly favorable to Lili-San. But in the opinion of the Red Army, the enemy was making preparations for a great drive against the Soviets as soon as the civil war was concluded, and it was no time for possibly disastrous putschism and adventures. This estimate proved to be entirely correct. With the events in Hunan, the Red Army's return to Jiangxi, and especially after the capture of Jian, Lili-Sanism was overcome in the army, and Li himself, proved to have been in error, soon lost his influence in the party. There was, however, a critical period in the army before Lili-Sanism was definitely buried. Part of the Third Corps favoured following out Li's line and demanded the separation of the Third Corps from the rest of the army. Peng De-Huai fought vigorously against this tendency, however, and succeeded in maintaining the unity of the forces under his command and their loyalty to the High Command. But the 20th Army, led by Liu Dechao, rose in open revolt, arrested the chairman of the Jiangxi Soviet, arrested many officers and officials, and attacked us politically on the basis of the Lili-San line. This occurred at Futian, and is known as the Futian incident, Futian being near Jian, then at the heart of the Soviet districts. The events produced a sensation, and to many it must have seemed that the fate of the revolution depended on the outcome of this struggle. However, the revolt was quickly suppressed due to the loyalty of the Third Army, to the general solidarity of the party and the Red troops, and to the support of the peasantry. Liu Dechao was arrested and other rebels disarmed and liquidated. Our line was reaffirmed, Leninism was definitely suppressed, and as a result the Soviet movement subsequently scored great gains. But Nanjing was now thoroughly aroused to the revolutionary potentials of the Soviets in Jiangxi, and by the end of 1930 began its first extermination campaign against the Red Army. Enemy forces totaling over 100,000 men began the encirclement of the Red areas, penetrating the 5 routes, under the chief command of Lu Diping. Against these troops the Red Army was then able to mobilize a total of about 40,000 men. By skillful use of maneuvering warfare we met and overcame this first campaign, with great victories. Following out the tactics of swift concentration and swift dispersal, we attacked each unit separately using our main forces. Admitting the enemy troops deeply into Soviet territory, we staged sudden concentrated attacks, in superior numbers, on isolated units of the Kuomintang troops, achieving positions of maneuver in which, momentarily, we could encircle them, thus reversing the general strategic advantage enjoyed by a numerically greatly superior army. By January 1931, this first campaign had been completely defeated. I believe that this would not have been possible except for 3 conditions achieved by the Red Army just before its commencement. First, the consolidation of the 1st and 3rd Army Corps under a centralized command. Second, the liquidation of the Lili-San line. And third, the triumph of the party over the anti-Bolshevik, or Li Dechao faction, and other active counter-revolutionaries within the Red Army and in the Soviet districts. After a respite of only 4 months, Nanjing launched its second campaign, under the supreme command of He Yingjin, now Minister of War. His forces exceeded 200,000 men, who moved into the Red areas by 7 routes. The situation for the Red Army was then thought to be very critical. The area of Soviet power was very small, resources were limited, equipment scanty, and enemy material strength vastly exceeded that of the Red Army in every aspect. To meet this offensive, however, the Red Army still clung to the same tactics that had thus far won success. Admitting the enemy columns well into Red territory, our main forces suddenly concentrated against the second route of the enemy, defeated several regiments, and destroyed their offensive power. Immediately afterwards we attacked in quick succession the 3rd route, the 6th, and the 7th, defeating each of them in turn. The 4th route retreated without giving battle, and the 5th route was partly destroyed. Within 14 days, the Red Army had fought 6 battles, and marched 8 days, ending with a decisive victory. With the break-up or retreat of the other 6 routes, the 1st Route Army, commanded by Jiang Guangnai and Cai Dinggai, withdrew without any serious fighting. 1 month later, Chiang Kai-shek took command of an army of 300,000 men for the final extermination of the, quote, Red Bandits. He was assisted by his ablest commanders, Chen Mingxiu, He Yingjin, and Chu Xiaoliang, each of whom had charge of a main route of advance. Chiang hoped to take the Red areas by storm, a rapid wiping up of the Red Bandits. He began by moving his armies 80 li a day into the heart of Soviet territory. This supplied the very conditions under which the Red Army fights best, and it soon proved the serious mistake of Chiang's tactics. With a main force of only 30,000 men, by a series of brilliant maneuvers, our army attacked 5 different columns in 5 days. In the first battle, the Red Army captured many enemy troops and large amounts of ammunition, guns, and equipment. By September, the 3rd campaign had been admitted to be a failure, and Chiang Kai-shek in October withdrew his troops. The Red Army now entered a period of comparative peace and growth. Expansion was very rapid. The First Soviet Congress was called on December the 11th of 1931, and the Central Soviet government was established, with myself as chairman. Zhou was elected commander-in-chief of the Red Army. In the same month there occurred the Great Ningdu Uprising, when more than 20,000 troops of the 28th Route Army of the Kuomintang revolted and joined the Red Army. They were led by Deng Zhentang and Zhao Bosheng. Zhao was later killed in battle in Jiangxi, but Deng is today still commander of the 5th Red Army, the 5th Army Corps having been created out of the troops taken in from the Ningdu Uprising. The Red Army now began offensives of its own. In 1932 it fought a great battle at Zhangzhou in Fujian and captured the city. In the south it attacked Chenqi Tang at Nanxiang, and on Chiang Kai-shek's front it stormed Luoan, Lizhuan, Jianning, and Taining. It attacked but did not occupy Ganzhou. From October 1932 onward, and until the beginning of the Long March to the northwest, I myself devoted my time almost exclusively to work with the Soviet government, leaving the military command to Zhou and others. In April 1933 began the fourth and, for Nanjing, perhaps most disastrous of its extermination campaigns. In the first battle of this period, 2 divisions were disarmed and 2 divisional commanders were captured. The 59th Division was partly destroyed, and the 52nd was completely destroyed. 13,000 men were captured in this one battle at Dalongping and Jiaohui in Luo'anxian. The Kuomintang's 11th Division, then Chiang Kai-shek's best, was next eliminated, being almost totally disarmed. Its commander was seriously wounded. These engagements proved decisive turning points, and the fourth campaign soon afterwards ended. Chiang Kai-shek at this time wrote to Chen Cheng, his field commander, that he considered this defeat the greatest humiliation in his life. Chen Cheng did not favour pushing the campaign. He told people then that, in his opinion, fighting the Reds was a lifetime job and a life sentence. Reports of this coming to Chiang Kai-shek, he removed Chen Cheng from the high command. For his fifth and last campaign, Chiang Kai-shek mobilized nearly 1 million men and adopted new tactics and strategy. Already in the fourth campaign, Chiang had, on the recommendation of his German advisers, begun the use of the blockhouse and fortifications system. In the fifth campaign, he placed his entire reliance upon it. In this period, we made 2 important errors. The first was the failure to unite with Tsai Ding-kai's army in 1933 during the Fujian Rebellion. The second was the adoption of the erroneous strategy of simple defense, abandoning our former tactics of maneuver. It was a serious mistake to meet the vastly superior Nanjing forces in positional warfare, at which the Red Army was neither technically nor spiritually at its best. As a result of these mistakes and the new tactics and strategy of Chiang's campaign, combined with the overwhelming numerical and technical superiority of the Kuomintang forces, the Red Army was obliged in 1934 to seek to change the conditions of its existence in Jiangxi, which were rapidly becoming more unfavourable. Second, the national political situation influenced the decision to move the scene of main operations to the northwest. Following Japan's invasion of Manchuria and Shanghai, the Soviet government had, as early as February 1932, formally declared war on Japan. This declaration, which could not, of course, be made effective owing to the blockade and encirclement of Soviet China by the Kuomintang troops, had been followed by the issuance of a manifesto calling for a united front of all armed forces in China to resist Japanese imperialism. Early in 1933, the Soviet government announced that it would cooperate with any white army on the basis of cessation of civil war and attacks on the Soviets and the Red Army, guarantee of civil liberties and democratic rights to the masses, and arming of the people for an anti-Japanese war. The fifth extermination campaign began in October 1933. In January 1934, the Second All-China Congress of Soviets was convened in Zhejiang, the Soviet capital, and a survey of the achievements of the revolution took place. Here I gave a long report, and here the Central Soviet government, as its personnel exists today, was elected. Preparations soon afterwards were made for the Long March. It was begun in October 1934, just a year after Chiang Kai-shek launched his last campaign, a year of almost constant fighting, struggle, and enormous losses on both sides. By January 1935, the main forces of the Red Army reached Shunyi in Guizhou. For the next 4 months, the army was almost constantly moving, and the most energetic combat and fighting took place. Through many, many difficulties across the longest and deepest and most dangerous rivers in China, across some of its highest and most hazardous mountain passes, through the country of fierce aborigines, through the empty grasslands, through cold and through intense heat, through wind and snow and rainstorm, pursued by half the white armies of China, through all these natural barriers and fighting its way past the local troops of Guangdong, Hunan, Guangxi, Guizhou, Yunnan, Xinjiang, Sichuan, Gansu, and Shenxi, the Red Army at last reached northern Shanxi in October 1935, and enlarged its base in China's Great Northwest. The victorious march of the Red Army and its triumphant arrival in Gansu and Shanxi, with its living forces still intact, was due first to the correct leadership of the Communist Party, and second to the great skill, courage, determination, and the almost superhuman endurance and revolutionary ardour of the basic cadres of our Soviet people. The Communist Party of China was, is, and will ever be faithful to Marxist-Leninism, and it will continue its struggles against every opportunist tendencies. In this determination lies one explanation of its invincibility and the almost certainty of its final victory.